Welcome back, everyone. The rule is do not stop, a Filipino literary symposium. And this second part of the program will focus on here it is. This afternoon program will focus on the experimental, feminist, and multivalent work of Barbara Jane Reyes. Can I ask our speakers to come up? Christine, Abiba, Janice Lobo Sapigao, and Kathleen de Guzman. Thank you. And to get us started, I'm going to introduce Janice Lobo Sapigao. Janice is a daughter of Filipina immigrants. She was named one of the San Francisco Bay Area's 2017 Bay Brilliant by KQED Arts. She is the author of 2 books of poetry, like a Solid to a Shadow and Microchips for Millions, and 2 other chapbooks. She is a Vona Voices and Kundiman Fellow and the Associate Editor of Tayo Literary Magazine. She co-founded Sunday Jump Open Mic series in LA. She earned her MFA in Writing from Cal Arts and has a BA in Ethnic Studies with honors from UC San Diego. She teaches English full-time at San Jose City College. Everybody, Janice Lobo Sapigao.
All right, thank you, PJ. I wanted to say thank you to PJ and to the Filipina-American Library. They've been hosting a lot of events that I have only been able to witness online from Facebook or Instagram, and it just seems like everything, I don't know, it just almost seems like a dream almost to kind of see all of these Filipinx-based events happen, like to not only just talk about them, but to see that they are actually taking place. So I really just want to say thank you to PJ for spearheading that. So can we clap real quick for PJ? Yes, I think that claps are actually more indicative of how many people are in the room, more than like silence or like space between us. So, you know, when I'm in big rooms like this, I really want and have an instinct towards being as irreverent as possible. And so I don't know how much of that is going to come out. I already feel like it is. So, you know, just like, excuse me if I partially feel like there's like a time and place to like shit on things, and maybe like this is a good time. But it's also a good time to honor Barbara Jane Reyes, which is what I'll be talking about today. So one of the questions that I get asked a lot, actually I've been asked this a lot as a writer, do you know Barbara Jane Reyes? Older Filipino writers asked me this in the community when they learned that I was interested in writing. And then advisors in my MFA program would also ask me this. They would ask me, hey, have you heard about Barbara Jane Reyes? And when they learned that I too was Filipina and that I was also from the Bay Area. Other Pinay writers and other MFA candidates and MFA dropouts, we would talk to each other about our writing projects, and we always asked each other, hey, do people ask you if you know Barbara Jane Reyes? And so I don't know if Barbara knows this or not, but that's a thing. Like, it has been a thing for Pinay writers, Filipinx writers who are writing now and working on book projects now, maybe publishing their first or second books. It's this strange phenomenon where people are asking us about her. And most of the time, I believe that is well-intentioned. However, when it happens a lot, and when it happens to so many different Filipino writers, I have to ask myself, like, why does this keep happening so frequently? Which I think points at another problem, which I also want to explore at some point. So, you know, when my MFA program advisors and professors, when they ask me these questions, and I can actually remember 3 separate times in graduate school where I was asked, do you know Barbara Jane Reyes? And to which I always said yes, But I was also always looking around the room for something else to latch onto, to sort of like not let that conversation go any further. Because there was a fear there. There was a fear that I would maybe expose some sort of hierarchy between myself and an advisor, or wanting to point out sort of like this low-level racism that exists at the end of that question. And I always said, of course, but I didn't want to add anything more to that. The rest of the conversation would always go another way. I wouldn't ask them about how they knew Barbara Jane Reyes, because I didn't know if they actually read her work more than they knew about it, right? And I think that was something I wanted to question. So I always knew, and I guess at the time I thought, oh, she's the only one. But I think maybe it was more like, she's the only one that people know about, read, and can reference. And to me, that points at another sort of problem, which is that there are so many, and Barbara writes about so many Pinay writers in the US and the Philippines who have come before her. This singularity of Pinay voices and Pinay experiences, I knew was one that Barbara herself would probably cringe at. It's something that I think she writes against. And it's something that I think she does not want for the Pinay futurity that she envisions and politically works towards in every single poem, collection, or class on Pinay poetics and Pinay literature that she teaches. And I want to say, yes, I know Barbara Jane Reyes. And I'm thankful that my knowledge and reading of her work is what brought me here today. So I took one of the methods that Barbara uses in her work, the method of using found language, which is, maybe most of you know, creating a collage with words. And so I think that Barbara asserts as Pinays, as Filipinos, that English is in many ways our found language. So I asked fellow Filipinx writers to contribute to this speech or presentation. I wanted to attempt to create a polyvocal text, which Barbara does in her books To Love as Aswang and Invocation to Daughters. So I asked a lot of Filipino writers to contribute, and everyone's busy, right? Everyone has a life, everyone's tired, everyone's got someone sick, someone to take care of. So I got at least 6 people, which is a lot. Okay, that's a lot. I got at least 6 people to contribute to this thing. And I asked them to describe Barbara, her work, and here's what they had to say. And they all gave me permission to say who they are. And they all will let me pay them with the honorarium I'm getting to sort of split it. Because I just feel like that's community. That's what should happen, you know? So they all gave me their Venmo handles. One of them refused, though, so I have to take them out for coffee instead. But anyway, so I asked, and here are my responses. Eileen Tabios, Pinay author of over 50, and I didn't know that number was that large. She has written 50 books, and she says about Barbara simply, Barbara is poetry. Arlene Biala, who's another Pinay writer and arts administrator, and the former Santa Clara County Poet Laureate, and also a co-collaborator of Barbara's, she says Barbara is unapologetic, necessary, tireless, rooted, and inspiring. I also asked my friend, Von Torres, who has worked with Barbara before, also heard about Barbara's work as a community college student in the Central Valley. And Von is also a teacher, and Von said about Barbara, she is Pinay poetry, not fucking around. I also asked Maria T. Vallarta, who is a writer, poet, and currently a PhD student in ethnic studies at UC Riverside. And she said that Barbara is influential, inspirational, Pinayist, Aswang poetics, and formative. And then I asked 2 more folks, Rachel Cruz, teacher, poet, and the recent winner of an American Book Award, but Filipinos got that. Her first book, God's Will for Monsters, for whom Barbara wrote the introduction, Rachel says Barbara is fire, ferocity, determination, mythic, and love. And lastly, Grace Burns, a former student of Barbara's at Mills College, also a queer Pinay poet, lecturer, teacher, writer. Grace says that Barbara is persistent, unapologetic, unwavering, dedicated, and resolved. So each of these folks shared varying different words about Barbara, and they also shared with me memories of how they each found her work. And from that, I decided to craft my own, 5 things I know about Barbara Jane Reyes. I know. Is this overwhelming, Barbara? Okay. So here are the 5 things that I know based on some of the responses I got. 1, Barbara Jane Reyes gives no fucks. So like her, I majored and earned my bachelor's in ethnic studies. And I think that what I see in her is that we have come to know intimately and more than I ever wanted about whiteness in the writing world, English, the push for branding that the writing industry wants and that they take for their publication, but then they keep you quiet when they dislike it. Barbara has taught me through her blogs that I, and maybe like Rachel Cruz, also still read today. Barbara has taught me just how much of a fuck not to give about the publishing and sort of like not being seen for what you are worth, especially as a writer. And I think that this is quite honestly something I still struggle with as someone who has had few reviews of my work, as a writer who hasn't won a fancy award, as a writer who lightweight wants one, but also doesn't care about it. I know that it's still worth writing, and Barbara writes on, and so many Pinays write on, and that is sort of like the writerly struggle, is to not get lost in this publishing or po-biz, as Barbara taught me, poetry business. So I think that's what the rule is when it says the rule is do not stop, which is to say simply we have to keep going. 2, Barbara is here because she also gives all the fucks about Pinay writings, about sharing poems, about shouting each other out on Facebook and Instagram, about blogging, about saying hell no to men who fetishize Filipina and Asian women. She gives all the fucks about documenting and working to undo the bullshit of a white world and white publishing industry, which is actually not, I think, that's not what writing is. Barbara led the charge behind the scenes of Phil Book Fest last year, I think, when there was an author who was invited and had like fetishized Filipinas on his website and in his writing, and because of her work behind the scenes, that writer was not invited anymore, which I think is what needs to happen. Number 3, Barbara is not here for it, not for the mansplaining, nor the sexist forgetting afforded to mostly men and boys, and maybe even like family members. Sometimes the resistance that we get in the Filipino community can be baffling. And I won't forget at another Filipino-American book festival when Barbara Jane was the moderator, and there was a man in the audience that didn't have a question, but he had sort of like a question story, but more like a story. And then it just became a big cloud of mansplaining. And Barbara said, okay, next, which I really appreciated as a way to sort of shut that down and as a way to put the focus back on what was happening during that panel, which is Pinay writers. Barbara also organizes many #AllPinayEverything events, and for that I'm really thankful. I think a lot of people have been able to cling to that as an identifier for their writing. Number 4, I read and came to understand Barbara's book Diwata with a young Latina 7th grader when I was living and working in Los Angeles. And this memory came to me as I was reflecting on what I should write about and share today. And I remember when I was reading Diwata with this student, we read through it page by page, line by line, poem by poem. And we would like take turns. I would read one poem, she would read another poem, and then we would have sort of like a brief discussion about what was happening in that poem, the symbolism, some of the sort of the dark images that I think I couldn't grasp, but this 7th grader had more of an idea about what was happening. And so I'll just never forget the way that we read that book. And I don't know, I hope Barbara, I just want Barbara to know that. And then number 5, I don't know how to say this, but I think my thing is that I'm surprised when people point out or talk about the Barbara in my work. So I also I'm a writer, poet, I have 2 books, as PJ mentioned, and a reviewer, of which I get few, right? Like, let's just make that clear. And it's okay, like, I want you to think I'm being self-deprecating more than I'm being honest. The reviews of which I get a few, the reviewer compared me to Barbara, and they said that mine is a mode heavily influenced by Barbara Jane Reyes and Emner Bessie Phillip, both women writers that I look up to. Sans the code switching of Reyes and the sparseness of Phillip's Zong, the work here is purposefully uncapitalized and interlarded as it is with graphics and lightly shaded binary code. They said that mine, like Barbara's, closes the distance between art and life by way of a generational reckoning. And I thought that was really beautiful, that someone could not only see into my work, but to see into its lineage. And I think these are the 5 words that I decided after these 5 things. I'm surprised that the reviewer could detect the ferocity, which is 1, the purpose, 2, irreverence, 3, strategy, 4, and the lineage that's in my work. And so if someone ever asked me if I knew Barbara Jane Reyes, I would say in much reverence, hell yes, I know Barbara Jane Reyes. And I mean that to say, like, I know and I'm aware of the Filipino writers that have come before me, and I want and I choose to stay connected to who they are, to hopefully show them. I think that hell yes is also a way of like showing and underlining that resistance, showing them that there's more than one Pinay writer, there's room for more than one Pinay writer, and there's much greater than their singularity on our diverse writing, our poetics, and our lives. So I want to know if you all, do you know Barbara Jane Reyes? Okay. No, I'm glad. Thank you for saying yes and hell yes. Can I ask you that one more time, and then maybe if you could respond in the affirmative? Do you know Barbara Jane Reyes? Yes. How can you not? Thank you.
Hell yes. I'm so glad we opened with Janice. Fabulous. All right, up next is Kathleen de Guzman. Kathleen is an assistant professor of English at San Francisco State University, where she teaches courses on Caribbean literature, global cities, and the novel. As a Filipina-American born in Miami and now based in the Bay Area, Kathleen is in the process of expanding her research and teaching to include the Philippines and its diaspora. So everybody, Kathleen.
Adjusting for height. Hello, everyone. So first, I'd like to begin with some thank yous. First of all, I thank PJ for taking a chance and extending an invitation to me for this event. And I also want to thank Mark of the Asian Art Museum and also the staff of the museum. And I'd furthermore like to thank all of you for spending your Saturday here at the symposium. I'd also like to pay tribute to Professor Don Mabalan. We both worked at SF State, but I unfortunately never had the chance to meet her personally, but I continue to feel her commitment to community through her scholarship and activism. So I think my talk today kind of circles back to the opening keynote and the emphasis there on place. And I hope to continue that today with my talk, which is basically an engagement with Barbara Jane Reyes' poetry through my own autobiographical angle. So this is called Geographies of Filipinics Poetics. How will witness testify? The final part of the poem, Prayer on Good Friday, from Barbara Jane Reyes' Invocation to Daughters, ends with the lines, "We howl, we witness, we testify, we stand firm, and you cannot break us. We are raw nerves, and we are fire. We rise, and in writing, we restore our lives." One of the aspects of Invocation to Daughters that fascinates me is its fluid yet firm voice. Some poems, such as Prayer on Good Friday and the 5 poems that share their title with the collection, use the communal pronoun we. Other poems, such as The Day, speak from an intimately autobiographical first person. Still others navigate the tension between the nameless and the individual, such as the Psalms for Mary Jane Veloso and Jennifer Loud, Filipinos exploited by labor and sexual violence. The poems in Invocation to Daughters simultaneously speak at you and with you as a reader. For Filipinics readers, at least for a Filipinics reader like myself, Reyes' poems show what I'd like to describe today as the geographies of Filipinics poetics. The broad topic of geography and literature is the central concern of my work as a literary scholar. As a bookish teenager growing up in South Florida, I equated literature with the cold New England and stifled London I read about in Sylvia Plath's poetry and Virginia Woolf's fiction. During college, I even spent a semester in London to live in Woolf's old neighborhood. I returned to Florida, however, with reoriented literary coordinates. I read the novel The Lonely Londoners by the Trinidad-born author Sam Selvin in one of my London classes. Selvin's novel, published in 1956, tells the story of colonial subjects from the Caribbean trying to earn money and build lives in a racist London after they were invited to the mother country to help rebuild the city after World War II. As a homesick Floridian in the notoriously overcast English capital, I latched on to the emotions that Selvin maps out in his novel, where characters from places such as Jamaica yearn for the force-ripe sun during their dreary walks around the city. So I trained as a specialist in Caribbean literature in grad school, a subject that allowed me to deeply study colonial history and its intersections with narrative fiction. But in the same way that London shifted and expanded my literary coordinates, so too did relocating to the Bay Area 2 years ago to begin my job as a new professor in the English department at San Francisco State. Growing up Filipina-American near Miami felt like such a private experience. I only heard Tagalog from my parents at home and my aunts and grandmother at family parties. I only ate Filipino food among family. And in school, I was always mistaken as Chinese by white people. Later on in high school, classmates with parents from places like Colombia and Peru would ask if I were Peruvian because, as they told me, sometimes people from Peru look Asian. In short, the Philippines felt like terra incognita, unknown territory in South Florida. I internalized this colonial mindset, and I've only started to seriously undo it since my move to the Bay. I sketch out this geographical autobiography because exploring it and reflecting on it, indeed voicing it at all, has been my most valuable takeaway from reading Barbara Jane Reyes' poetry. In a blog post on her website earlier this month, Reyes reflects on reading Jessica Hagedorn's novel Dog Eaters as an undergrad at UC Berkeley. She goes on to describe how she didn't get the novel on her first couple of readings, but learned that such is, quote, the beauty of book, unquote. One can return to it grow, and come to understand. I'm still coming to understand what Reyes's poetry means to me, especially her most recent work, Invocation to Daughters, and her 2005 book, Poeta on San Francisco. Growing up in South Florida, I didn't have access to the curriculums of ethnic studies, and in fact felt isolated by the Asian American literature course that I took in college. The class focused on writers of East Asian descent, and even when we read Carlos Bulason's America's in the Heart, I also felt disconnected as a suburban Filipino-American kid. So coming to Reyes's poetry as an adult reader outside of the classroom helps me learn how I need to unlearn my scholarly training in order to deepen my personal curriculum. Poeta on San Francisco opens with a prologue that tells readers, and this is here for you on the screen, what may be so edgy about this state of emergency is my lack of apology for what I am bound to do. And this reminds me of the energies that Janice was just talking about in her talk. An edgy quality of Reyes's poetry is how it reminds a literary scholar such as myself that literature is always doing things that the slow pace and institutional structures of academia aren't well suited to recognize. My research in Caribbean literature, for example, seeks another configuration for talking about the relationship that Caribbean writers share, for talking about the relationship that Caribbean writers such as Jamaica Kincaid share with the Victorian British authors that they were compelled to learn and admire through the colonial school system. This work begins by stepping back and acknowledging that both the Caribbean and colonial Britain are archipelagos. They are both island systems interdependent on each other and connected via oceans and seas. In the parlance of literary scholarship, what I'm doing is defamiliarizing a metropole-colony binary through the geographic lens of the scattered yet connected archipelago. But in Reyes's poetry, an archipelago of Filipinx poetics has always already been in motion. Since moving to the Bay Area, I've been strangely fascinated by the ubiquity of Filipinx presences, and I was just talking about this during the break as well. In my classes at San Francisco State, I'm no longer the only Filipina-American in the room, like I was in nearly all of my educational experiences from kindergarten through graduate school, really. And I hear Tagalog when I'm at Target and Safeway, and even on some Muni lines. And in my early months here, a casual date involved getting food from the Senor Sisig food truck. And it wasn't like my date was trying to impress me with their knowledge of Filipino food. It was simply something to enjoy on a Friday evening before going to the Oakland Museum of California, as unceremonial as getting popcorn at the movies. At the same time, the idea of the Bay Area as a Filipinx landscape seems woefully invisible unless one has the cultural historical literacy to question white heteropatriarchy. Earlier this year, someone told me Filipino food is a niche subject after I told them I had just attended a talk at UC Berkeley about Filipino food, foodies, and authenticity, as if those things couldn't coexist, of the idea of being both a foodie and consuming Filipino food. And this is where reading Reyes's poetry feels so urgently life-giving. The poems in Poeta on San Francisco write what's here and there by first of all recognizing that here and there involves more than meets the eye. In the poem, I might be missing a slide, sorry about that. In the poem, Calle de los Orientales, Reyes layers the histories of San Francisco's Chinatown with a Spanish language title and lines that mention, quote, mapped cosmopolitan mudflats, marshland, and formal lifetimes, end quote, to tourist gaze and local advice on the language of pointing to navigate souvenir shopping. Another poem, Kumintang, bears a title that refers to the Philippine province of Batangas. At the same time, the poem's stanzas speak to a critique of imperialism that also resonates with European colonial violence in other parts of Asia as well as Africa. Quote, that blank space on your map, that's where I was born. The more blank your map, the more darkness for exploration, end quote. The final stanza asks, can you appreciate the neither here nor there of it all? The line feels like a taunt to imperial military forces. Taken on its own, however, these words might also speak for how the Filipinx diaspora inscribes itself wherever its members are flung. A poem toward the end of the Reorient section of Poeta on San Francisco highlights the expansive geographies of Filipinx poetics that Reyes so keenly maps. The final three stanzas in Confessional read, for the names I have been given, Hispanic, hussy, slanty-eyed hoe, cannot bind to any one place. Los Angeles, Mexico City, Hong Kong, Hanoi, Bangkok, San Juan, Havana, Madrid, Manila, San Francisco, and even more. These stanzas demonstrate that labels and slurs can only fix and pigeonhole up to a point. Rather than cling to an easy nationalism to combat prejudice, the speaker in Confessional remains open to the affiliations that exist precisely because of the traumas of colonialism and migration. I'm reminded of Martinican poet Aimé Césaire and his epic poem, Notebook of a Return to the Native Land. There, the speaker names port cities around the world to highlight the forced cosmopolitanism of slavery. Similar to Césaire's speaker, the speaker in Confessional chants place names to undo colonial mapping, indeed to remap through solidarity and similarity. The poem Consider This Procession also highlights this poetics of geographic layering. Contemplating the city of San Francisco, the speaker in this poem asks, could we ever know how much blood has seeped into the soil, and then declares, on esta ciudad, we have forgotten how to speak. These lines situate readers in the brutality of the past, but also in the project of opening to hope and healing. The final stanza reads, and this was also quoted in the opening keynote, in our collisions, we learn to make new. From our lacerated and fractured selves, appendages resembling tails, horns, and siempre, wings to capture breath. The imagery of wings capturing breath offers a snapshot of a phoenix-like creature rising from the ashes of colonized cityscapes. Alongside Walt Whitman and Langston Hughes, before her, Reyes fashions a song of complex selves that sing America. Moving ahead to the present moment and the poetry in Invocation to Daughters, the speakers in Reyes' poetry seem to discard the weight of mythological imagery while at the same time still confronting past and present inequities. Threading the topic of geographies throughout Invocation to Daughters, we see poems such as Consume tackle Guantanamo as well as gentrification in urban neighborhoods. Elsewhere, the poem An Apology belatedly mourns the murder of a Filipino woman in Monterey and wonders why the Filipinx community is sometimes so silent. But the most compelling geographic aspect of Invocation to Daughters is how it globalizes gender without whitewashing it. The we and I that speak throughout the poems is clearly that of a brown woman rightly fed up with white heteropatriarchy. Too often, the story of Filipinx literature in the US centers men. Reyes' work is thus a critique of the archive through its embrace of a collective, women-centric, and inclusive anonymity. I want to conclude then by turning to one of the final stanzas in the collection, which is from the closing poem, Wisdom's Rebuke. You don't get to catalog me, you don't get to warehouse me, you don't get to rescue me, you don't get to touch me, you don't get to explain me. You are not the standard by which I judge my own worth. You don't get to draw my boundaries. This is a mantra that has kept me going since moving to the Bay and picking up Invocation to Daughters. I am still learning to practice its insights in both my scholarly work and my day-to-day life. Thank you.
Thank you so much for very thoughtful work. Thank you. Up next is Christine Abiba. Christine is a queer Filipina-American whose commitment to understanding who we are as humans is almost as fervent as their love for dancing. Using oral history as a tool, Christine is interested in combining critical thought and personal storytelling to understand how we relate to the world. As a recent graduate of the University of San Francisco, Christine is passionate about using the sounds of our voices to tell our stories loudly, urgently, with responsibility, and in celebration. So, welcome, Christine.
Hello, adjusting for height as well. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, PJ and Mark, for opening this space for us to be here, and especially also thank you for last Thursday for making a space for Pinay liminality. Today I will be speaking about my experiences as a student of Professor Barbara Jane Reyes. So my name is Christine Abiba, and I graduated from USF, University of San Francisco, last May. And in my time at USF, I was really drawn to the study of theology and religious studies because it was the biggest envelope for all my questions. It allowed me to look at the world and ask, what does it mean to be human through a lens of history, philosophy, sociology, and ethics. But the question of what it meant to be human didn't really hit home until I took Professor Barbara Jane Reyes' class. Because in her class, I was asked to see the world in a very cultural and intersectional lens. I was asking myself, how do I understand the world as a Pinay? So, BJR's class was really hard for me because I was asking hard questions such as, what does it look like when a Pinay finds her strength in being honest with her vulnerabilities? How does one understand herself in her fullness? What if the Pinay is relentless in asserting herself? What if the Pinay finds her strength not only in their beauty and empowerment, but also in their brokenness? By teaching us how to ask these questions, to be critical and conscious of our personal but collective experiences, Professor BJR invited us students to come forward and to come into power. So in Pinay Lit, I remember the first day of class. I remember being one of the timid Pinays who was really excited but really didn't know what to expect. I sat in the front row alongside some people that I barely knew, and I looked up to see Professor Barbara Jane Reyes dressed in all black and very intent on teaching a lesson on the very first day of class. So when Professor started introducing herself, I was stunned. I had never seen a professor that looked like me or made jokes about my upbringing, made jokes that I could relate to because that was my upbringing. And I had never seen, and who even went to the same middle school as me in Fremont. So without much exposure to Pinay authored books at the time, my eyes widened when our entire syllabus consisted of Filipina Pinay authors. And as the semester progressed, we delved deeply into reading. I remember sitting on the campus lawn and turning the pages of The Land of the Forgotten Girls by Erin and Chada Kelly and One Tribe by Evelina Galang. And then I remember being fascinated and clicked every single link on the Tayo Literary Magazine website just so I could read everything. And I was reading Melissa Chadburn and Melissa Sippin. And then I would Instagram all the comics from Trinidad Escobar and Linda Berry and send them to my cousin. And I remember this is just like a list of all the things we did in class, but I remember watching a documentary about Stockton with Don Mabalon. I remember watching music videos of Rocky Rivera, and we, as a class, watched a performance down at Counterpulse with Sam May Dizon. And I was so excited by the content of the course that I sent copies of my syllabus to literally every Pinay that I knew. And until we were sharing copies, like all my copies of professors' books are very worn because I keep sharing them. And prior to the class, I hadn't picked up any Pinoy authored books, and I was stunned because as I was reading all these, I felt like my whole world was changing. Okay, still here. With all this information, also came this deep dive into Pinay literature also paved way towards serious question asking. In class discussions, in weekly reflections, in conversations outside of class, we started tackling hard topics like colorism, reproductive labor, intergenerational trauma, cultural excavation, and decolonization. And this was challenging work, and we didn't always have the answers. But as difficult and abstract as these concepts were, Professor Barbara Jane Reyes provided us with tools to approach them. We started discussing themes, literary devices, symbols, and the characters we found in our readings. To bring it closer home, we were asked to parallel these concepts with our knowledge of Filipino core values, such as bayanihan, kapwa, utang na loob, and hiya. It felt like our minds were being blown every Tuesday and Thursday. And after every class, a group of us Pinays would just stay in the cafeteria just to relate our stories to the question that Barbara Jane Reyes brought up into the class. And through this listening to each other's cuentos, we started to apply the tools that we got from class towards understanding our own experiences. So in the classroom, Professor served as a role model because she was a professor with a lot of real-ass things to say and who took the work that we did in the classroom very seriously. She was committed to nurturing our ability to learn, to be critical, but most importantly, our ability to empathize. By reading such a wide range of nuanced stories from multiple mediums of Pinays coming from many intersections, we were introduced to a very particular yet a very universal understanding of being people of the diaspora. That being said, many of our classroom topics did not shy away from being political. We questioned and critiqued the ways in which Filipinas have been constructed as passive, objectified, and commodified. We were instructed to construct new feminist portraits of ourselves, interrogating gender and power, and complicating the narratives of Pinays with a very emotional and affective depth. For our final projects, we were tasked with writing our own epistemologies. How do we know what we know about being Pinay? And I remember asking my classmates, who were becoming my close friends, what they would write about. And we were also nervous because we were aware of the vulnerability of this assignment. But we knew that these questions were necessary for our own liberation, even if it meant confronting our own maternal estrangements, questions about identity, and healing from past traumas. For me, writing about my own Pinay epistemology created an avalanche of emotional work, asking me to humanize my own family history, to interrogate my relationship to gender and queerness, and ultimately brought up questions about how to love in liminality. So speaking from my own experience, Professor Barbara Jane Reyes not only inspired empowerment among her students, but she also gave us tools for transformation. So prior to taking Pinay literature, I hardly ever spoke in class. I never raised my hand. I was always too shy. But at the end of the semester, I found myself raising my hand at every single question because I had so many things to say. And because BJR protected the integrity of the classroom, Pinay Lit became a very Pinayist space where we were expected to hold ourselves accountable to the rigor and the vulnerability of the course. And this allowed us to begin to make sense of our positions in the world, but more importantly, how to envision a more just and compassionate future. So after the class ended, I was enamored by the exposure to Pinay insights and storytelling that I began to immerse myself very deeply into the Filipino-American culture here in the Bay. I went to poetry readings at Eastwind, at SFPL, at the Bayanihan Center, at the Philam Book Fest, like I was hungry for it. And I would read poems by Janice and Amy Suzara and Rachel Cruz on all my BART rides. That eventually led me to declare a Philippine Studies minor at USF, and I started involving myself in Filipino-American organizations all across the Bay until I found Maganda magazine at UC Berkeley, and there and Maganda is the longest running Filipina-American lit mag here in the States, and Professor was actually the editor-in-chief at Maganda the year I was born. So, but it was here at Maganda where I found other Filipinx artists and writers and creators who are asking the same questions. And in the year that I interned there, I performed at my first open mic, published my first piece, and co-emceed the mag's launch, continuing the hard work of finding the sound of my voice. So as an educator, Barbara Jane Reyes encouraged me to seek what was beyond my immediate communities and learning environments. And with the feminist framework that she gave to us, I started using my own voice loudly, trusting my own knowledge, challenging communities that I was a part of, and looking for kasamahan and asking hard questions. Moreover, this transformation also occurred outside of the classroom and eventually evolved into an oral history project. We continued to convene in community. We would meet at each other's houses and drink San Migs and just write and share our own stories. We would continue to ask the question what it meant to be Pinay. We began recording our conversations with equipment provided by StoryCorps and inviting other Pinays to our space. And since our class ended in the fall of 2016, we have recorded 16 interviews, 8 of which are archived in the American Folklore Center at the Library of Congress. By recording our stories, we archive our cuentos of liminality and practice Pinayism by putting our Pinay identities at the forefront. And basically in Pinay liminality, inspired by BJR's class, we try to understand who we are in community, affirm the experience of the in-between, where we are trying to create and bridge meanings between multiple thresholds of construct and culture. And we're trying to share our interactions with gender, race, and class, reflect on our histories of colonization and cultural excavation, reflect on the song and ability of our Pinay bodies, our relationship to religion and spirituality, and our understanding of home, hiya, utang na loob, self, and belonging. All of this reflection and extension of what we had learned in class. 2 nights ago, we were here downstairs at the Asian Art Museum to facilitate our first workshop, What is Pinay Liminality? I was so shocked because so many people came through. There were so many people, like the door kept opening and opening, and all these folks came in from East Bay, from the city, from Soma, from San Jose, and it was just out of this world because we all came here to find a place where we could understand ourselves in community. So that night we featured recordings that we have collected, Pinay artists, and another upcoming Pinay oral history project called Pinex Rising, so we can make this space ours. We asked participants to pair up and be in conversation about what does it mean to be Pinay, how do you know, and how does that intersect with your other identities, roles, and relationships. And then that night felt like the beginning of much more gatherings, much more questioning, and just a contribution to all the momentum of Pinay power that's happening here in the Bay. In Barbara Jane Reyes' poem, To Proceed You Must First Understand, the last line reads, "Tell me about the sound of your voice." And I believe every student of hers is given this invitation to use literature as the pathway towards feminism, towards asserting oneself, and towards thinking of ourselves as we. As a former student of hers, I still crave to be in that space. Sometimes when I can, I go back to her classroom and just sit in. She let me interview her for my thesis on reclamation and Bay Area Pinay artists. And I know her impact continues because I meet more of her students, and they who take her class, and I see them using the sound of their voices loudly too. So thank you, BJR, for giving us the tools for transformation, but also accompanying us in this question asking. And then in this picture on the right is my graduation cap. I decided to put the last line on on the top. And then the other photo I just really liked. But thank you so much.
Wow, thank you so much, Christine. And when she said a lot of people, it was a lot of people coming in on Thursday. So next, we're gonna move on to Barbara Jane herself. Barbara Jane Reyes is gonna deliver a literary address for all of us today and the future through the internet. Barbara Jane Reyes is the author of Invocation to Daughters. She was born in Manila, Philippines, raised in the San Francisco Bay Area, and is the author of 4 previous poetry collections, Gravities of Center, Poeta in San Francisco, Diwata, and To Love Us Aswang. So everyone, Barbara Jane Reyes.
Wow, what more is there to say? Oh my gosh. Thank you. I'm so humbled. It's nuts. But thank you, Mark. Thank you, PJ, for having this space and having us in your space. This is amazing. It's pretty amazing. So there's this slideshow that is just kind of going to go on loop, and it's kind of like a family album. Some of you may recognize some of the faces in here, but I was looking through my Flickr collection and my Instagram, right, to see the Philam literary community. What have we been up to since I since I first started kind of keeping these documents? This is me when I was very young. I mean, look at that hoodie. It's ridiculous, right? This is me and Tony when we were young, Tony Robles. This is like I'm growing old with Tony Robles, right? Look at that. Anyway, so this is just going to go on loop, and I just think that it's, it's just been really nice to have, this kind of community that, that has had my back and has seen me through much craziness, right? A lot of trial and error, a lot of fuck-ups, a lot of successes, It's been pretty amazing. So once again, thank you all for being here and for all of these words, all of this just amazing stuff. And let me just jump right into this thing. You know what annoys me? people who won't see the through line from Joe Bataan to Bruno Mars. You ever wonder about the sound of a poet rapping with 10,000 carabaos in the dark? You ever eat fish and rice with your hands off styrofoam plates in a hole on the wall south of Market? You ever roll down your window while speeding down Highway 101 to smell the Pajaro River? What if that's the poem and you missed it because you were looking for something roseate, effete, something that smells like prestige? So I'm Barbara Jane Reyes, and I'm a poet. All of the things I say to you today, I say as a poet, one who works with line, lyric, and language. My concerns and my values and my concerns are conveyed and contained in these. Something I have been learning throughout the course of my formal and informal education as a poet is that we can and must make many spaces to tell our stories in many different ways. These are the stories that I tell. When my parents immigrated here, they lived in a tiny apartment in the Mission District. They soon moved to a tiny apartment in Daly City. A couple of years later, they bought a house and we moved to Fremont. I grew up in Fremont. I went to kindergarten and had 8 years of Catholic education in Fremont. I went to Catholic high school in Hayward. I went to college in Berkeley. I went to graduate school in San Francisco. I bought a home in Oakland. I'm of here. In Fremont, in the late 1970s, the tiny handful of other Filipinos that we knew were family friends, folks who my parents knew from way back. We called them cousins, though we weren't blood related. In the 1970s, one of the priests at Holy Spirit Church was Filipino. Father Flores blessed our house. Father Flores also blessed my mother's brand new Toyota Celica. We lived by apricot orchards. It felt like outside of our family parties, no one knew what a Filipino was. I had no idea that our still agricultural Fremont, that California, that the West Coast, that Hawaii were cultivated by thousands of Filipino laborers who had been here for decades. If you return to Carlos Bulosan's America's in the Heart, see where Alos's train stops in empty grape fields in Niles. That's Fremont. He wakes up in San Jose. 4th grade California history never mentioned us. American history mentioned the Filipino-American War in passing, but did not say anything about our having come here. I never read anything a Filipino had written. How could I have possibly become an author under these circumstances? If I were to revisit Bulosan's I'm Not a Laughing Man, I would see something of myself there, angry because no one ever told me or taught me that I could write what I could write, that it was not impossible, that it could have meaning larger than myself, these words I did not know I needed to commit to the page. No one ever told me that I could find my life in letters. Imagine that, the girl child of immigrants, an omission in literary and historical texts, thinking she could write books. When I discovered I loved poetry, I didn't know that I had the right to. I didn't know that poetry could ever be mine. Imagine this scrappy little immigrant girl who was always ignored, who was always shushed, who was always told to leave it and do something more practical, who had come to believe that no one would ever be interested in the stories of her life and her family, who trekked to City Lights Books in North Beach and stayed for hours at a time, who dreamed she could one day have a place there. Who could imagine that? I found Jessica Hagedorn's novel Dog Eaters when I was 19. This was 1990, before you were born, Christine. I learned that Hagedorn was once a scrappy young Filipina immigrant who lived in San Francisco, who hung out at City Lights Books, who was mentored by Kenneth Rexroth. I learned that Hagedorn's first couple of collections of poetry, Dangerous Music and Pet Food and Tropical Apparitions, were published by the indie publisher Stefan Vincent's Momo's Press here in San Francisco. I learned that Hagedorn was one of Ntozake Shange's colored girls in the choreo poem for colored girls who have considered suicide when the rainbow is enough. I learned this is poetry. I met Ray Orchiola in Professor Ronald Takaki's Asian American History class in the spring of 1990 at UC Berkeley. Ray told me he had just started Maganda magazine and he was looking for young Filipino-Americans to come and be a part of this thing. Imagine that, Filipino-Americans publishing themselves and their own. And perhaps this is why I trusted him enough to hand him a stack of my handwritten poems and final versions when only few people very close to me had ever seen my poems at all. I did my first poetry reading on April 29th, 1990 for Maganda magazine at the Faculty Glade on the UC Berkeley campus. We sat in the grass and I shared poems. This felt exactly how a poet should share poems, sitting in the grass on a lovely spring afternoon. There were perhaps 7 or so people there, all Filipinos. My dad drove up from Fremont for this. His hay fever was so bad, he stood under a tree in the shade far away, but within eyesight. I don't know if he actually heard me speak. It would be easy to say the rest is history, but let me say this instead. Publication enables your words to travel outside of yourself. It finds others like you, others who have been looking for someone like you. Because of Maganda magazine, I found Kearney Street Workshop and Baypaw. Or Kearney Street Workshop and Baypaw found me. That was the beginning of my public life in letters. I found myself sharing the mic with Jaime Jacinto, with Jeff Tagami, with Shirley Anchetta, with Al Robles himself. Once we read poetry in the Chinese Culture Center overlooking the hole in the ground on Kearney and Jackson Street. It was like reading poetry to ghosts. I wrote this poem in 2002. It's so old, I can't find an actual word file of it. I suspect it's on one of the floppy disks that I've held onto, though I don't have a computer that can read floppy disks anymore. This is called Place Markers. So Thea, I'm so glad you talked about this poem earlier today. Place Markers. For Al Robles and for the elders whose stories he told. Kearney and Jackson, San Francisco, California, summer 2001. There's a gaping hole in the ground in the middle of this overcrowded city. I've never felt I'd earned the right to write about this gaping hole, which you gave a voice and a face while all I could do was watch. I never thought it was mine, the weeds and chunks of concrete and waste here. I can't move from this spot. The breeze entangles my long hair into this chain link fence now woven with my fingers. Ghosts I never knew, tricksters and lovers, you should have just asked me to stay. I would have stayed. Risal Social Club, El Dorado and Lafayette, Stockton, California, 2002. My hands flat upon these walls, cold leaden chips of white paint yellowed. Time could have forgotten, but now I can't take my palms and forehead away from this coolness in Central Valley Sunday, where elders in their finery shield their eyes, worked back-breaking fields until they were unable, gathered here circa 1920, circa 1930, till it all closed down. Down the street now, McDonald's, right behind us, a freeway. Here I wish to keep my palms and bittersweetly baptized forehead on this wall. I walk along its facade in the adjacent Mariposa Hotel. I peer into its wrought iron gate to hear water drip, drip upon cracked concrete. I peer up through the rusted fire escape at the sky. I want to see these slickly pomaded, sharp-dressed spirits that I feel as I run my palms along the crevices of these walls. My fingers and love lines gather ancient dirt and peeling paint. My brothers and sisters watch me intently. They find no peculiarity in my attachment to a building I have never seen before. They want to touch my hands for the dirt I have collected. I've come here to be filled with you. You were here. All of you were here. St. Patrick's Church, 3rd Street and Mission, San Francisco, California, summer 1995. At an iHotel commemoration, cha-chaing in the church's basement, Rona and I are converged upon from opposite ends of the room by two Pinoys, one young, one old. The spiky-haired frat boy in baggy blue jeans cuts in and moves with her, Northern Cali style. I commit to memory the aftershave, the black fedora, the red silk tie patterned with black hearts, the red pressed silk shirt, the bone white blazer, the highly shined leather shoes of the old Pinoy who takes my hand as I immediately follow his dance steps. The rule is, do not stop. Waving the index finger of his left hand, he must be 80. I can't keep up with him. Fillmore Street, San Francisco, California. Jazz and life on the edges are daily improvisations when the streets are cold. Families of folks who sit at your table, sell you the morning paper, wander this neighborhood and collect your stories for safekeeping. Poet elder, you are conduit and vessel, your voice a protest. Who says history is only about dead white people? You've transcribed history. It's about us. Dryden Road, Fremont, California. Down the street from New Hong Kong Money, a pho house, a parking lot filled with expensive SUVs and souped-up rice rockets, I am of a different generation of suburban comfort in newly painted tract homes. There was once an apricot orchard here. There was once a red farmhouse edged with white, a solitary oak tree and a hanging tire. Now my parents' house contains slick Japanese cars in a 2-car garage. Jasmine vines and sunset-colored hibiscus overrun the outside walls and trellises of their renovated home. Fragrance always drifts in through the open skylights. Manong, I feel you have been here before the dirt in my parents' backyard was always so fertile. The lemon tree is large as brush fire. Its boughs hang low, heavy with fruit. I came here when degreed professionals were in Cold War demand, when martial law tore our home apart. I never thought you would claim me as your little sister. Clement Street, San Francisco, California. Jaime always tells this story. When he was 15 years old, walking through Chinatown, he met you, your hair out to here but a little less gray, your arms full of grocery bags. The star apples are what I remember most, the hermit Zen monk descending the mountain to nourish us. Inada says, you were so Zen, you didn't need to read your poetry, you just were. I've always wanted to write you poems. I just wanted you to remember my name. And when you did, I felt I had finally arrived. I attended Intimacy and Geography, the National Asian American Poetry Festival in New York City in 2003. There, I met the Filipino-American poets who would later go on to found Kundiman. They asked me over dinner, what was it like, the Filipino-American poetry scene in San Francisco? I told them, it's deep, it's DIY, and the lineage is everything. If Al Robles remembers who you are, then you have made it. Their eyes were so big in their faces, who knows what they were thinking? How were they supposed to know what it meant, and how was it supposed to have any value to them? They were in and of a different world, one that at the time I wasn't so sure whether I could, whether I even wanted to be a part of. Back then, I felt if I didn't adopt their definitions of success, one that, from my vantage point, centered prestigious publishers and book awards, then I would always just be some scrappy brown kid from this far corner, this unruly margin of the country, and that wouldn't mean anything to this body called American poetry. I never wanted my writing education to take me from this place and from this community. I wanted my writing education to make me stronger at writing about my and about our being here. I was the only Pinay in my poetry program at San Francisco State University. Imagine that, where roughly 2,000 students in the entire student body identify as Filipino, in the Bay Area where over 450,000 Filipinos live. Those odds could stop a Pinay, could erase a Pinay, could silence a Pinay before she's even learned she has a voice. But there are so many of us, Pinay and Pinoy writers and artists, aggressively, courageously creating bodies of evidence, even master works, of our being here, living and breathing and struggling here. We've been here, we're still here. Not alien, we are of here. Not alien, have come, am here. Among the xenophobes, the deadbeat dads and gangsters among the white liberals, people who mind colored folks, among the dirty hipsters, overschooled armchair activists, among the sex traffickers, white supremacists, wife beaters, among the day laborers, undocumented dreamers, among the inalienable, the PTSD, the evicted, among the emigrated, the refugees, the polyglots, among the accented Taglish speaking, have come, am here. In this fast and gritty place, we are creating spaces for us to congregate, to explore and to hone our craft, to amplify. We are defining our own literary and artistic traditions. We're not asking for anyone's permission. I write here in this place my family and I have found and made our lives. I write to discover the complexity of our lives in this place. In poetic lines, the details of our lives reveal themselves, and here we make meaning. When we buried my father here, I wrote like hell. That was the only thing I knew how to do. I do want to share one poem or excerpts of a poem from Invocation to Daughters, and this is called The Day, which many of you have heard before. 6:45 a.m. The very last meal I had with my father was arroz negro y petralsol paella, fideuá caldosa, pork bellies, okra, and a bourbon elderflower cocktail in uptown Oakland at Duende. 4 days later, his brain got lost in language. No words. His body forgot how to walk and how to swallow. His lungs decided to stop taking air. He never came home. He's on my mind when I go to sleep. He's on my mind when I wake up. 8:36 a.m. At the AC Transit 26 bus stop, I'm late to my day job. Morning commute reminds me of my father. Coconut oil, slicked hair behind his ears, ducktail in the back. He ironed the creases in his slacks. He left the house with Ralph Lauren polo aftershave on his collar. He clipped his Bechtel badge to his pocket protector. Protractor, mechanical pencils, drafting tools arranged within reach, thermos of coffee in his Dymo-labeled briefcase, 10-speed bike to Union City BART station. That was before coconut oil became trendy. That was before the layoffs and the unemployment checks. After this, combing his hair became a chore. 9:02 a.m. Lihua told me that daughters stolen from their homelands do not lose their power. Their tongues, their palates adapt. New roots and unbloomed buds, bullets, become new spells, new medicine. You do not get lost on an island. You take pieces of it, shell, sand, seed, with you when you must take flight. Jelly jars, perfume vials, Tupperware, Ziploc bags, you use what you've got. 10:50 a.m. Isabel Laksamana, a 13-year-old girl in Tacoma, Washington, died by suicide after jumping off a highway overpass on Friday, May 29th. Days before, Laksamana's father had reportedly punished her for an unspecified transgression by cutting off her hair and uploading a video to YouTube. 11:27 a.m. I belong in this fluorescent-lit cubicle. The privilege of this fluorescent-lit cubicle, where I thumb through 1,000-page spiral-bound indexes. According to the International Classification of Diseases, ICD-10-CM, F4320, adjustment disorder, unspecified, includes culture shock, grief reaction, and nostalgia. To be a Pinay daughter is classifiable, diagnosable, reimbursable with the proper documentation. It is a disorder. It requires professional intervention. It may require a prescription. To be a Pinay daughter should be covered by Obamacare. To be a Pinay daughter may be covered by your managed care plan. Please consult your manual. 12:14 p.m. There are ladybugs on my father's grave. 2:20 p.m. You're all girls? You don't have any brothers? Your poor father. How awful that must have been for him. Your mother never gave him any sons. 2:22 p.m. My sisters and I all kept our father's name. 3:03 p.m. I must tell you that the first time I heard Prince's Controversy was on KDIA 13 a.m. in 1981. I was 10, dancing and tiggling. I'd never heard anything like this. Falsetto, synth, electric guitar, and liminality. Because of KDIA, I know that the following year, the Gap Band dropped Gap Band 4. My older sister owned it on vinyl. 33 1/3 gatefold LP. It's a perfect album. Let no one tell you different. 4:32 p.m. I am tired of talking about race. These are the facts. I was born on the same island where my mother was born, where my father was born, where my mother's mother and my mother's father, where my father's mother and my father's father were born. Go back many more generations and you will find our birthplaces are that very same island. The true point should not be why I write this, but how and in whose tongues. 4:35 p.m. You don't get lost on an island. 5:02 p.m. 2 fingers on a pulse. He was breathing, still, when I left his room. He was, and one by one, they were wheeling away machines. The blipping monitor told me what my hands felt still. He was warm. He was 73. He was a tough motherfucker, stubborn enough to live to 100, so that he could grumble and elbow us, so that he could give us mad side eye. Instead, just hum and blip, hum and blip. A music I can't manage. Exhale, no words. 5:24 p.m. Sometimes you are damaged. You think poetry will repair you. You think poetry should repair you. You shake your fist at it when it doesn't. You walk hand in hand with your damage into the world. You do not speak. You're surprised when people register you're there. 5:51 p.m. Sometimes I can snap out of invisibility. On 8th and Broadway, Marshawn Lynch and I make eye contact. I refrain from telling him that it's my birthday and may I please take a selfie with him. Why can't this interaction have happened with Draymond Green instead? 6:21 p.m. There is no printed news story I can find about Norife Herrera Jones that does not emphasize her dismemberment and the esteemed alma mater of her estranged 74-year-old white husband, her murderer. 7:53 p.m. You don't have kids? Why don't you have kids? You should have kids. How terrible it must be for your husband. You should give your husband kids. You're a bad wife. How terrible it must be for your parents. You should give your parents grandkids. You are a bad daughter. 9:03 p.m. On a pulse, that stopped. The breathing stopped. He was warm, but the breathing stopped. Now he flies to greet my ancestors, gloss of feathers dimmed in the orange quiescence of the sun. There is no need now for sublingual drops of morphine, for the sleep that let him slip away from us. 9:05 p.m. I can't manage. No words. 9:11 p.m. Sometimes you are broken. Poetry won't fix you. Poetry can't fix you. It doesn't have lungs to give you its air. It doesn't have hands to stitch your parts back together, to make you tea, to drive you home. 10:26 p.m. My hashtag Woman Crush Wednesday, Pia Alonso Wurzbach's Instagram tells me that she's just learned the proper mechanics of the fastball. Noah Syndergaard taught her this for Filipino Heritage Night at Citi Field. In my perfect world, Pia would throw out the first pitch at AT&T Park. Tim Lincecum would still be our ace. He would be the one to teach her how to throw, even though Timmy's the freak. Arnel Pineda would sing Lights in the middle of the eighth. And all the starstruck Filipinos in the house would radiate so much light, we'd be the fucking Maharlika Nebula supernova of San Francisco. 11:55 p.m. I remember holding the dove's warmth in my palms. I was still. It was still. It was waiting for me to unlace my fingers. There, the horizon above a young oak tree, mustard flowers, poppies, and autumn snails. The dove's gentle bones pushed off my palms into the orange quiescence of the sun. This is how I said goodbye to my father, shouting his name at the sky. 11:57 p.m. I sometimes remember to floss. I always wear socks to bed, even in the summertime. I sometimes build a pillow fort. I always think about that day, that with my mother's permission, they wheeled my father out of the hospital covered in a velvet shroud, that I could not sleep for a long time, that I could not close my eyes, that every night noise might have been him visiting me. And that was all I could do, right? But I'm an elder now, yeah? Grieving has made me go gray. I've been at this for decades. Poets have come up with me, Arlene Biala, Tony Robles. Poets continue coming up. Amy Suzara, Janice Sapigao, Rachel Cruz, Jason Bayani, in the South Bay, in the suburbs, in Oakland, in San Francisco. We're not stopping anytime soon. We're pushing. There will always be that 19-year-old Pinay who comes through my classroom, a young Pinay who finds our books and feels a little less invisible, who feels emboldened to commit her words to the page, who feels emboldened to start telling her own story. I write here, grounded in the world and in the community which has nurtured and sustained me and challenged me and pushed me. The very writers and authors who first said to me, "We see you, sister. We see you and we got you." It's like Kapwa, hella indigenous, which does not mean gone native. The definition for pakikipagkapwa-tao is, this is in Tagalog too, kakayahin umunawa sa damdamin ng iba. For real, right? Like Ruby Ibarra and 100 Pinays giving you resting bitch face all at once. You know, like those syndicated full-color photographs of boys and men in LeBron James and Steph Curry jerseys, thin flip-flops on the feet. One body together, shouldering a nation. One bamboo hut at a time. One set of lungs breathing. One heart. Isang mahal. isang bagsak. Thank you very much.
All right, so that concludes The Rule Is Do Not Stop. I welcome everybody to come hang out at the library downstairs in the resource room and talk story and get to know people, read a book, read a poem, and hang out. Oh, the books. Oh, and the bookstore is carrying Filipino books downstairs, so feel free to grab some of those. And thank you again. Thank you, Janice, Kat, Christine, Barbara Jane, and Thea, Jason, Tony, and Shirley. And long live iHotel.